September 3rd, 1945. A villa in the Austrian Alps, surrounded by barbed wire and American soldiers. The air smells of autumn rain and diesel from the military trucks idling outside. An old man in a worn tweed jacket sits at a drafting table, hands trembling as he rolls up blueprints. Plans for a machine so massive it could crush a house beneath its treads. Ferdinand Porsche, the engineer who gave Hitler his dream car and his nightmare tanks, knows what's coming. In 3 hours, French authorities will arrest him. In 20 months, the world will forget his name. But the machines he built, those will never be forgotten. To understand how a car designer became a war criminal, we need to go back to 1934. Adolf Hitler had a vision, a people's car, a Volkswagen, affordable enough for every German family. He needed an engineer brilliant enough to make it real and ambitious enough to ignore the warning signs. Ferdinand Porsche was both. Born in 1875 in Bohemia, Porsche never finished formal engineering school. He learned by doing, designing electric vehicles at age 23, building race cars that shattered speed records, earning a reputation as the man who could solve impossible problems. When Hitler summoned him to the Reich Chancellery in 1934, Porsche saw opportunity, a state-sponsored factory, unlimited resources, a chance to build the car he dreamed of for decades. The Volkswagen Beetle emerged from that meeting. Curved, compact, air-cooled, a design so efficient it would survive into the 21st century. Hitler loved it. Porsche delivered the first prototypes by 1936. Production began at a massive new factory in Wolfsburg. But then, September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The People's Car factory pivoted overnight. Now it would build military vehicles, Kübelwagens for the Wehrmacht, amphibious Schwimmwagens for river crossings. And Porsche, the civilian car designer, was about to enter the armor business. The German military had a problem by 1942. Soviet T-34 tanks were slaughtering panzer divisions on the Eastern Front. Their sloped armor deflected German shells like rainwater off a roof. The Wehrmacht needed heavier guns, mounted on heavier platforms. Hitler announced a competition. Design a new heavy tank destroyer. 2 engineers stepped forward, Ferdinand Porsche and Friedrich Henschel. Porsche had never designed a tank in his life. Henschel had been building armor vehicles since 1935. It should have been no contest. Porsche's design was radical. The VK 45.01P, later renamed the Ferdinand, used a gasoline-electric drive system. Think of it like a diesel locomotive. A gasoline engine generated electricity, which powered electric motors at each track. No transmission. No complicated gear linkages. On paper, brilliant. In reality, a maintenance nightmare. The engine and generators overheated constantly. Electrical systems failed in mud and snow. And the weight, 65 tons, crushing suspension components Porsche had borrowed from existing designs never meant to carry that load. Henschel's competing design, simpler, mechanical, reliable, won the tank contract. It became the legendary Tiger Eye. But Hitler, mesmerized by Porsche's unconventional thinking, refused to let the Ferdinand die. He ordered 90 chassis already built to be converted into tank destroyers. Mount an 88mm PaK-43 gun, the most powerful anti-tank weapon in the German arsenal, on the hull. Strip away the turret to save weight. The result, the Panzer Jogger Ferdinand, later renamed Elephant after modifications. Picture machine, 11 feet tall, 26 feet long, armor 8 inches thick on the front glacis. The 88mm gun could punch through any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2 miles. It carried 50 rounds of ammunition. 2 crewmen sat in the fighting compartment, surrounded by steel plate and the constant hum of overworked electrical generators. No machine gun. Porsche, the car designer, had forgotten to include secondary armament. In close combat, the Ferdinand was blind and defenseless. 89 Ferdinands deployed to the Eastern Front in July 1943 for Operation Citadel, the massive German offensive at Kursk. Soviet commanders had never seen anything like them. The 88mm guns destroyed T-34s from distances the Soviets thought impossible. One Ferdinand knocked out 16 tanks in a single engagement, but then the breakdowns began. Engines seized in the Ukrainian summer heat. Electrical fires erupted. Transmissions failed. Of the 89 deployed, only a handful remained operational after 2 weeks. Soviet infantry, realizing the beasts had no machine guns, swarmed them with satchel charges and Molotov cocktails. The Ferdinand crews could only watch through narrow vision slits as enemy soldiers crawled across their hulls, untouchable. And this is where the story takes a turn no one expected. But before we get to that, if you're finding this untold history as fascinating as I am, drop a comment below. Which WW2 tank do you think was the most over-engineered disaster? And hit that like button. It tells YouTube to recommend this to more history lovers like you. Meanwhile, Hitler's obsession with superlatives grew darker. In 1942, he summoned Porsche again. This time, the request was absurd. Design the heaviest tank ever built. Something so massive it would terrify enemies into surrender just by existing. Porsche, ever the optimist, said yes. The result was Panzer VIII Maus. The Maus, a name dripping with German irony. The Maus weighed 188 tons. Picture a steel rectangle the size of a small house, mounted on treads 4 feet wide. Armor 9 inches thick on the turret front. Impervious to every Allied anti-tank weapon. Twin guns, a 128mm main cannon, and a 75mm coaxial gun. A 1,200 horsepower Daimler-Benz engine that could barely push the monster to 13 miles per hour on flat ground. The suspension groaned under the weight. Engineers calculated that no bridge in Europe could support it. Porsche's solution: make it waterproof and drive across riverbeds underwater, supplied with air through a snorkel tube. In testing, this failed spectacularly. 2 Maus prototypes were built at the Alkit factory in Berlin. Only one received a complete turret. Neither ever saw combat. By late 1944, the war was lost, and even Hitler's staff quietly shelved the project. When Soviet forces captured the Alkit factory in April 1945, they found the 2 Maus prototypes abandoned. Soviet engineers welded the turret from one onto the hull of the other, creating a single Franken Maus. It sits today in the Kubinka Tank Museum outside Moscow, a monument to engineering ambition unmoored from reality. But here's the truth most people miss. Porsche knew the Maus was impractical. His engineers told him. Test data confirmed it. Yet he kept building, kept refining, kept pitching Hitler on even heavier designs. A 1,000-ton landship called a Rat, a 1,500-ton behemoth called a Monster. Why? Because the Reich paid him. Because his factories stayed open. Because slave laborers, thousands of them pulled from concentration camps and POW facilities, worked 18-hour shifts building his impossible machines while he collected paychecks and patents. The Volkswagen factory at Wolfsburg employed over 20,000 forced laborers by 1944. Poles, Russians, French prisoners, concentration camp inmates. They assembled Kübelwagens and aircraft components under guard towers and searchlights. Porsche toured the facility regularly. He signed off on production quotas. He knew. Documents captured after the war prove it. Memos with his signature, approving labor allocations, requesting more workers as attrition rates climbed. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Porsche fled to his villa in Austria. The Americans found him there and placed him under house arrest. For 6 months, he cooperated with Allied technical teams, explaining his designs, handing over blueprints. He thought his engineering knowledge would buy immunity. He was wrong. December 5, 1945, French authorities arrived at the villa with an arrest warrant. Porsche was charged as a war criminal, not for the tanks themselves, but for the systematic exploitation of forced labor. The French wanted justice for their citizens who had died in his factories. They extradited him to Baden-Baden, then transferred him to Dijon prison. He was 70 years old. His health was failing. He spent 20 months in a cell barely larger than a Beetle's interior, the curved car that had made him famous now, just a memory. It's impossible to hear these stories without feeling something. Anger, awe, sadness, all of it. Let me know in the comments how you're processing this. And if you believe these forgotten engineers deserve to be remembered, that like button is how we make sure their stories don't disappear. The French never formally tried Porsche. The evidence was overwhelming, but the geopolitical winds were shifting. By 1947, the Cold War was beginning. Western powers needed German industrial expertise to rebuild Europe and counter Soviet influence. Porsche's engineering knowledge, especially in automotive design, was suddenly valuable again. On August 1st, 1947, French authorities released him on bail paid by his family. He returned to Austria, broken but free. Porsche's company had survived the war, barely. His son, Ferry Porsche, had kept the business alive by doing repair work on Volkswagens and farm equipment. Ferdinand, too old and too infamous to lead, stepped back. Ferry took over. In 1948, Ferry designed a new sports car using Volkswagen components, the Porsche 356. It was small, light, fast. Everything the mouse wasn't. By 1950, orders were pouring in. The Porsche name, tainted by war, began its rehabilitation through speed and elegance. Ferdinand Porsche never spoke publicly about the war. He gave no interviews about the Ferdinand, the mouse, the forced laborers. He spent his final years in Stuttgart, attending company meetings occasionally, but mostly fading into silence. On January 30th, 1951, he suffered a stroke. He died that same day, 75 years old, in a country still sorting through the rubble of his legacy. Ferry Porsche continued the work. In 1964, his team unveiled the Porsche 911, a rear-engine sports car that would become one of the most iconic automobiles in history. Today, Porsche AG is a luxury empire, selling hundreds of thousands of cars annually, worth billions. The company officially acknowledged its wartime use of forced labor in 1998, 53 years after the war ended. They contributed to a German compensation fund for victims. The apology came decades too late for most who had suffered. Walk past a Porsche dealership today. Sleek Caymans and Taycan's gleam under showroom lights. Nowhere in the marketing materials will you read about the Ferdinand tank destroyer, broken down in a Ukrainian wheat field. Nowhere will you find photos of the mouse, too heavy to fight. The brand has been scrubbed clean, polished until the past disappears beneath layers of horsepower and prestige. But the machines remain. A single elephant tank destroyer survives, preserved at the U.S. Army Ordnance Museum in Maryland. The Soviet mouse sits in Kubinka, rusting slowly, a steel ghost. And millions of Volkswagen Beetles, descendants of Ferdinand's original 1930s design, still roll along roads worldwide, carrying people who will never know the hands that drew the first blueprints also drew weapons of war. This is just one inventor's story. There are dozens more, engineers who built the V-2 rocket, the Enigma machine, the jet engine, names history forgot or sanitized, machines that shaped the world. I've got their stories ready for you. The next video covers a man who invented the proximity fuse and saved thousands of Allied lives, then died penniless. Click that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and I'll see you in the next one. The car designer who never finished school, the tank builder who never won a battle, the prisoner who became a luxury legend, and the truth that hides behind every gleaming hood ornament.